It was the winter of 1918, one of the coldest winters Russia had ever known. The country was falling apart. The Russian Empire had just collapsed after years of war and revolution. Now, a brutal civil war had begun. One side was called the Reds, made up of revolutionaries who supported the new Bolshevik government. The other side was the Whites, who wanted to bring back the old system, the Tsars and the royal rule. Everywhere, towns were burning, soldiers were fighting, and people were running for their lives. Russia wasn't one country anymore. It was a land divided by chaos, hunger, and fear. Across the vast, snowy land, trains became lifelines. They carried everything: soldiers heading to the front, families escaping war zones, and even prisoners being transported from one camp to another. Some trains were full of hope, others full of despair. Among those countless trains was one quiet, wooden train sitting at a small, snow-covered station somewhere deep in Siberia. Its destination was far to the east, toward places that were said to be safer, away from the gunfire, the battles, and the spreading civil war. People crowded inside, shivering in their heavy coats. Mothers held their children close. Soldiers leaned against the walls, their rifles across their laps. Prisoners sat in the corner under the watchful eyes of guards. Everyone shared the same thought: if we can just get far enough away, maybe we'll survive. The whistle blew. Steam hissed into the frozen air. Slowly, the train began to move, its wheels crunching through the snow-covered tracks. No one on board could have known that this simple journey, meant to lead them to safety, was instead leading them to one of the darkest and most haunting tragedies of the Russian Civil War. The train was very long, made up of several old wooden carriages connected together. Inside, every seat and every corner was packed with men, women, and children. Some were ordinary civilians, farmers, mothers, and workers, trying to get away from the gunfire and fighting that had spread across Russia. Others were prisoners of war, guarded by tired soldiers who sat near the doors, rifles resting between their knees. Everyone was exhausted, hungry, and afraid of what lay ahead. There was barely any food on board. People carried what little they could: a few pieces of bread, maybe some potatoes or dried meat wrapped in cloth. Water froze almost as soon as it was poured. The passengers tried to melt snow in small pots to have something to drink. The only warmth came from tiny iron stoves placed in some of the carriages. A small fire burned inside each one, fed by bits of wood or coal when available. But the fires didn't last long, and there wasn't enough fuel for everyone. Those sitting far from the stove could feel nothing but cold air biting through their clothes. It was early December when the train finally began its journey. Outside, the land of Siberia was already deep in winter. The ground was buried under thick snow, the trees were coated in white ice, and the rivers were frozen so solid that horses could walk across them. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Temperatures had fallen to -40 degrees Celsius, so cold that a person's skin could freeze in seconds if they took off their gloves. Frost clung to eyelashes. Every breath turned into a cloud of white mist. The metal sides of the train were covered in ice so thick that touching them with bare skin could rip it off like glue. As the train moved forward, its steam engine groaned and wheezed, forcing its way through the endless snow. The wheels screeched on the frozen rails. The sound of metal echoed across the silent forests. Through the windows, passengers could see nothing but white emptiness. Endless stretches of snow and forests of dark, frozen pine trees bending under the weight of ice. Day and night blended together. Sometimes the sky was gray, sometimes black, but always filled with drifting snow. Inside, the cold crept in no matter how many blankets or coats people used. The fires in the stoves went out one by one. People began rubbing their hands, breathing into them, and pressing close to one another for warmth. The train pushed on through the wilderness, deeper and deeper into Siberia's frozen heart. Days passed slowly. The cold grew sharper, and for those trapped inside that train, it was starting to feel less like a journey, and more like a slow, freezing battle against time. After days of crawling through the frozen wilderness, the train reached a lonely stretch of track in the middle of nowhere. There were no towns, no houses, not even a sign of human life. Just endless snow and wind stretching in every direction. Then, Suddenly, the train shuddered and began to slow down. The sound of the engine grew weaker until it stopped completely. The great metal beast that had carried them this far had died. The engine had broken down. At first, the crew thought it was something simple. Maybe the pipes were frozen or the fire had gone out in the boiler. But when they stepped outside to look, the cold hit them like a wall. The air was so sharp it burned their lungs. Metal tools froze to their hands. The wind screamed through the open fields, carrying snow that stung their faces like tiny needles. They tried to repair the engine, but it was hopeless. The freezing temperature had made the metal brittle and cracked the pipes. The coal supply was running low, and the fire inside the boiler refused to burn properly in the bitter wind. Hour after hour, they worked, stamping their feet to keep warm, but the machine would not come back to life. Finally, the crew had to admit the truth: the train wasn't going anywhere. They were completely stranded. There was no telegraph line along this part of the track. No phone, no radio, no way to call for help. The nearest station was dozens of miles away, far beyond what anyone could walk in that kind of weather. Outside, the snow was so deep it reached people's knees and sometimes even their waists. And in that cold, -40 degrees Celsius, a person could freeze to death in minutes. At first, people tried to stay calm. They told themselves that maybe another train would pass by soon, or that help would come. Some passengers even laughed nervously, trying to keep their spirits up. But as hours passed and no sound came from the tracks, fear began to spread. The passengers knew they had to do something to keep warm, or they wouldn't last the night. They started burning whatever they could find. Pieces of wood from the seats, shelves, even parts of the floor. The smell of smoke filled the carriages. People crowded close to the tiny stoves, holding out their hands to catch a little warmth. Mothers wrapped their children in layers of blankets and coats. Soldiers shared what little fuel they had with civilians. Every breath they exhaled turned into white mist, freezing almost instantly in the air. Frost began to form on the walls and even on people's hair and eyelashes. For a while it worked. The fires kept them alive a little longer. But soon the wood was gone. The stoves went dark, one by one, until there was nothing left to burn. Then came the silence, only the sound of the wind outside, howling endlessly across the steppe. The warmth faded, the air turned still, and inside the train, the battle against the cold was only beginning. As the long, dark hours dragged on, the temperature inside the train dropped lower and lower. The small bit of heat from the last fires faded away, replaced by an icy stillness that crept through every wall and floorboard. The air became so cold that every breath turned into a cloud of frost, hanging in the air before freezing and falling like snowflakes. People began to speak less and less, their voices weak and cracked from the cold. Soon, the carriages fell almost completely silent. Some passengers tried to sleep to escape the misery, curling up beside one another to share what little body warmth remained. But in that kind of cold, sleep was deadly. Those who drifted off never woke up again. They simply froze where they lay, peaceful looking, but gone forever. Inside the train, the cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a living enemy. When metal becomes that cold, it turns into something dangerous. The walls of the train, the seats, even the doorknobs all became icy traps that sucked the heat from people's skin. Touching the metal with bare hands could tear the flesh away. Water bottles turned to solid ice, cracking open with sharp pops. Bread became so hard that people could barely bite into it. Potatoes and meat froze like stones. Hunger grew, but no one could eat. Desperate to survive, some passengers tried to build small fires right on the floor using bits of wood or torn cloth. But it didn't last. The flames barely burned in the thin, frozen air, and smoke quickly filled the cars, making it hard to breathe. The fires went out almost as soon as they began, leaving behind only the choking smell of ash. The soldiers guarding the prisoners huddled near the doors, their rifles clutched tightly against their chests. They had been trained to obey orders, but now they were facing a cruel choice. They could leave the train and try to walk through miles of snow, knowing they'd likely freeze to death within minutes, or they could stay inside, where the cold would kill them more slowly, surrounded by the people they were supposed to protect. No one spoke about it out loud, but everyone knew what the answer was. The soldiers chose to stay, so they sat down beside the others. Guards, prisoners, civilians, all trapped together in the same frozen coffin, waiting in silence as the frost thickened on the windows and the world outside disappeared under white. Several days passed before anyone even realized that the train had disappeared. Other trains that were supposed to use the same tracks never saw it again, and a nearby station eventually noticed that it had never arrived. So a rescue team was sent out, made up of railway workers and soldiers, to search the snowy wastelands for any sign of the missing train. They followed the tracks for miles, through forests buried in snow and across open plains where the wind howled endlessly. It was so cold that the rescuers had to stop often to warm their hands and faces, or they'd risk frostbite. Finally, far out in the empty Siberian wilderness, they saw it, the train, standing silently on the track, half buried in snow. There was no smoke from the chimney, no footprints, no sound. It just stood there, quiet and still, like a ghost made of ice. When the rescuers climbed aboard, they opened the first carriage door, and what greeted them was a silence so heavy that it felt alive. Inside, everyone was dead, but it wasn't a chaotic scene. There were no signs of panic or struggle. The passengers were still sitting upright in their seats, as if they had simply fallen asleep. Their eyes were closed, their hands folded neatly in their laps. Their clothes were covered in frost, and their hair and eyelashes were stiff with ice. It looked almost peaceful, but it wasn't. The rescuers said it felt like walking into a frozen dream, or a church made of ice. Frost covered every surface like a blanket of glass. Some people had their arms around each other, holding tight even in death. Parents had wrapped themselves around their children, trying to keep them warm until their last breath. In the engine room at the front of the train, the rescuers found the engineer and the fireman, the men who had tried to keep the train alive. They were still in their seats beside the controls, frozen solid in place, their faces pale and hard like marble. It looked as if they had refused to leave their posts, determined to do their duty until the very end. Everywhere the rescuers looked, the same heartbreaking scene repeated. Icicles hung from the ceiling, reaching down like glass daggers. The walls sparkled with ice, and even the windows were coated so thickly in frost that no light could enter. The entire train glittered under the faint sunlight, beautiful but horrifying. One of the rescuers later said it felt like time itself had stopped inside that train. The people, the air, even the movement of life, everything had been frozen in that single terrible moment. They had gone silent together, somewhere in the middle of nowhere, on a track that stretched endlessly across the frozen heart of Siberia. The rescuers quickly realized that getting the bodies out of the train wouldn't be easy. When they tried to lift one of the passengers, they discovered the bodies were frozen completely solid, as hard as stone. It was impossible to move them. Even pulling them apart was dangerous because some were frozen together, their arms locked around one another in final embraces. The rescuers had no choice but to stop. They knew that if they forced the bodies loose, they would break. The only way to recover them was to wait for warmer weather, or somehow bring heat to slowly thaw the ice. But in the middle of Siberia, in the heart of winter, warmth was a rare thing. So for a long time, the passengers of the train stayed where they were, frozen in place exactly as they had died. No one ever knew for sure how many people had been on that train. Some reports said maybe 50 or 60, others whispered that there were hundreds. But record-keeping during the Russian Civil War was almost impossible. Paperwork was lost, stations were destroyed, and no one knew who had truly boarded that doomed journey. All that remained certain was the end. Everyone who had been on that train had perished. As word of the tragedy spread, the locals began calling it the Train of Death. It became a story that railway workers would tell in hushed voices, a warning of what the Siberian cold could do. Over the years, people who worked along the same stretch of track began to share strange stories. They said that sometimes, in heavy snowstorms, they saw old carriages sitting far out in the distance, half buried in white. When they looked closer, the carriages would be empty, but some swore they saw shapes behind the frosted glass, as if people were still sitting inside. Others claimed that on quiet nights, you could hear the faint sound of a whistle, far away, even though no train was scheduled to pass. Most people said these were just myths, stories made up by lonely railway workers during long, freezing nights. But even if they weren't true, the legend of the train of death lived on. It became one of those haunting tales that Siberia never forgot. A reminder of how deadly and unforgiving the cold could be, and how one winter night, an entire train simply stopped in the snow and never moved again. The tragedy of the train of death was more than just a story about people freezing in the snow. It was a mirror of Russia itself in 1918, a country trapped in its own kind of cold. At that time, the Russian Civil War had left the nation broken and bleeding. Cities were in ruins, villages were empty, and millions of people wandered the frozen land, searching for food, shelter, or safety. Families were torn apart, soldiers fought without knowing what they were really fighting for, and hunger followed everyone like a shadow. It was as if the whole country had frozen, not just from the winter, but from fear and chaos. The government had fallen apart, neighbors turned on each other, and hope was buried under the same snow that covered the endless plains. The story of the train. A group of people stranded in the middle of nowhere, slowly freezing as the world moved on, became a symbol of that suffering. They were ordinary people caught between war and nature, both equally cruel. The frozen train stood in the snow for weeks, maybe months, before it was finally removed. But long after the tracks were cleared, the memory of what happened there remained. It became a grim monument, not built of stone or metal, but of silence and ice. It reminded people of how fragile life is, and how, in the endless fight between man and nature, it's often nature that wins. And perhaps the saddest part of all is that the passengers had done nothing wrong. They were simply trying to escape a war that had already taken everything from them. But even in running, they found no mercy. So the train of death became a symbol of endurance and despair, of how far people will go to survive, and how sometimes survival itself is stolen by forces too great to fight. In the end, it stood as a frozen message from the past, a reminder that sometimes nature itself is deadlier than war.